One way of thinking about that is exactly the guy Nordhaus that I mentioned before, the first climate economist who've actually gotten a Nobel Prize for this, and he's sort of grounded this whole idea of how do you think about costs and benefits in terms of climate. So he's done a model where he can look at what are the total costs of all the bad impacts and also the benefits that will come from global warming. There's overwhelmingly negative impacts. That's why we saw the negative outcomes in the total. What he's shown is then, all right, if we don't do anything, so he expects that no policy, so we don't have any policy whatsoever in climate, we'll get to 4.1 degree by 2100. Sorry. Oh, that reveals from the wrong end. But anyway, so then he's also looking at an optimal outcome and a 2.5 degree outcome. He can't actually get to 2 degrees because he says we're too late to do that. And that's probably also what most people believe. We're just not going to be able to get there. So 2.5 degrees is the closest that we can actually get. What he finds is these are the costs if we look at how damaging will this be for the world. If we have a no policy, well, that'll cost us, if you discount all of the costs back till today, in today's dollars, it'll cost us about $140 trillion. That's a lot of money. If we cut back to 3.5 degrees, it'll cost us only about, $85 trillion. And if we cut all the way back to 2.5 degrees, we can actually reduce the total damage for the world back to about $45 trillion. This is very much what you'd expect. The lower the temperature rise, the less damage. This seems to indicate we got to go for the lowest cost. Of course, we got to go for the lowest temperature. But it ignores the fact that there's also policy costs. And you need to add those because we also have to pay the policy cost. What's the policy cost? Well, the policy cost for getting to 2.5 degrees is actually humongous. To get to the optimal outcome is much, much less. And of course, to get to the no policy has virtually no policy cost. So the reality here is we got to recognize that there's both a cost from climate change, but there's also a cost for climate policy. We need to pay both. And so we need to find the optimum. That's what he's done. That's what he got the Nobel Prize for. And basically, he shows the best outcome is the one where we limit it to 3.5 degrees. We have much less climate damage, but we also still have a fairly low policy cost. Or to put it in terms of GDP, if you look across, and he actually looks across 5 centuries, the total cost of the 2.5 degrees is 4% of GDP. The 3.5 is just 2.3% of GDP, and the no policy is 3%. So it's very clear we can actually carve out a good outcome or a better outcome than no policy if we restrict carbon emissions somewhat. But there's 2 important points here. One is don't overdo it. Now, in some way, you could say the world is not doing that because we're not doing anything. But the reality is we're not doing anything except for a few places like California, like the European Union, where we're actually doing it a lot, and we're paying way too much. And of course, where we should be cutting carbon emissions is probably India and China and other places where it's very, very much cheaper to do, even if it just involves a transfer. The other part here is to recognize this all requires that everybody is extremely rational. So it assumes that we do this cost effectively across the planet for everyone. So that is, we have one uniform carbon tax across the entire globe that keeps increasing permanently across the entire globe in sync with everyone. If that doesn't strike you as slightly optimistic, that you probably need to readjust your expectations of the world. In reality, that very well might mean that the policy costs will get much, much larger. And again, what that shows you is we can do a little bit, but we shouldn't do very much. If we do too much, we might actually end up doing a lot worse than what we could otherwise have done. Now, what climate policies do work? Well, clearly a good economic crisis work. Had the 2008 crisis been longer, had it been a little bit more expensive, we would actually have succeeded with the Kyoto Protocol. But it's a very, very hard sell for most politicians to come out and say, let's all be poorer, right? That doesn't work as a policy. and for a wide variety of reasons. If you look at what the EU has achieved with wind and solar, we've cut about 100 megatons of CO2 annually, but we pay a lot for that privilege. We pay about $40 billion in subsidies every year. The US shale gas revolution has probably cut about 3 times as much CO2. That's why the US has actually cut more CO2 than any other nation in the last decade, because they've switched from coal to gas. And that's been basically a market-based mechanism. They make a lot of money from the shale gas revolution. So they both make money and they cut more CO2. Obviously, that's a much, much better approach and much more sellable to the electorates. In general, what this shows is that you need to focus a lot more on innovation. Fundamentally, the problem is if cutting carbon emissions is still very expensive, few people will do a little bit to feel virtuous, but we won't actually do very much. But if we can make green energy cheaper than fossil fuels, of course, everyone will switch. And that's why we did a prioritization with lots and lots of climate economists involved and 3 Nobel laureates. We found that the best long-term strategy is actually investing much more in green energy R&D. We suggest that we should increase our R&D into green energy about 6 times. It would still be a lot less than what we're spending now, but unlike the present-day policy, it would actually fix global warming in the long run. Just to give you a sense of proportion, we estimate that the current EU climate policy, because it's even more expensive and it's very poorly done, does about 3 cents of climate good for every dollar spent. If you spent that on research and development into green energy, we estimate you could do about $11 of climate good for every dollar spent. That's a very good investment, actually. So the whole point here is to recognize that if we can stop believing it's the end of the world, and we can start recognizing that our current policies are actually incredibly ineffective in achieving something that we want to do, namely cutting carbon emissions, we can recognize we need a different approach, which is about R&D, and making sure that we actually fix global warming. And we can also start to have a talk about, and I want to spend the last 3-5 minutes to talk about that for most people on this planet, global warming is one of the least important things in the world. Just, remember, there's lots of things like poverty, hunger, all these other things. Let me just ask you, what are the world's deadliest environmental problems? This is the outcome from the latest global burden of disease. What overwhelmingly kills people is air pollution. Outdoor air pollution and indoor air pollution. Indoor air pollution is something we don't think about, but that's the fact that a lot of people still use wood and dung, cardboard to cook inside, and that actually pollutes their homes incredibly much. Indoor air pollution used to be worse than outdoor air pollution, but in the last couple of decades, because we've gotten much richer, a lot of people have stopped using dirty fuels indoor, and that means that outdoor air pollution has actually become the biggest problem. That kills about 7 million people every year. Then, as you said, water, lead, unsafe sanitation, hand washing, ozone. There is global warming, and then radon at the very bottom. Global warming is a problem, but it's not by any means one of the biggest issues. And of course, if you remember, what are the biggest problems? If you just talk about deadly, I'm just going to show you the same graph, but also remember poverty. Poverty kills many, many more. Poverty probably kills every 3rd person that dies in the world. So about 18 million people every year. And what is the problem if we only talk about that one, the global warming, when there's so many other issues out there? And that's one of the things that my organization does, and I just want to show you very, very quickly. So we did a lot of things on looking at how do you actually get real people involved in thinking about what are the big issues. So the UN actually did an estimate. They went out and asked about 10 million people, what are the things that you would like us to prioritize? The UN removed it from their webpage because they didn't give the right answer, but this is you can still access it on this. So they said education is the most important, then health, jobs, no corruption, nutrition, no violence, clean water and sanitation, support for people who can't work, better infrastructure, quality, reliable energy, no discrimination, political freedom, protect forests, rivers and oceans, phone and internet, and then action on climate change. These are the 16 options that they had. The world said very clearly, of all the things we care about, climate change comes last. Not true for the developed world, mind you. If you had taken one of those surveys, you're very likely to put it up at the very top. But of course, that's because you don't have to worry about your kids dying from easily curable infectious disease or not having access to food or not getting a good education, right? So the point here is to recognize that for most of the world, it's very, very different things that matter. And so what we try to do is to look at where can you spend money and do the most good. And I'm just going to show you a very brief outcome of that. So we looked, for instance, on climate and energy, and we looked at a lot of different things. For instance, on double renewable energy. If you double renewable energy, that means you get much more energy to everyone. It's not a huge amount, but much more, especially to the world's poor. You actually get so much more energy that it's worth about $480 billion. That's great. The problem is it costs $580 billion a year to provide that energy. That's a bad deal. That's why we find that for every dollar spent, you'll do about 80 cents worth of good. The 2-degree target, as I just talked about, turns out to be a bad deal. Climate change adaptation is okay, but it's actually not all that great. Electricity to everyone will give you $5 back. Modern cooking fuels to almost 800 million people because it reduces indoor air pollution is a great investment. Phase out fossil fuel subsidies, which is still a stupid thing they do in Venezuela, Russia, Saudi Arabia, many other places. We should definitely get rid of that. Those are some of the great things that you can do, but remember there are many, many others, and I'm just showing you a very, very short version of this. A mobile broadband, developing countries, every dollar spent will do $17 of good, mostly because it'll increase growth rates. Half coral reef loss around the world, because it's very, very cheap to have the first half of coral reef loss. Every dollar spent will do $24 worth of good because it'll both increase fisheries, because reefs act as hatcheries. It'll increase tourism, it'll increase jobs, and of course, it'll actually preserve biodiversity. Reduced child malnutrition turns out to be an incredible investment because if you get good nutrition to small kids, it means that their brains develop more, so when they go to school, they learn more, and hence they become more productive when they're adults. If you look at some of the other things for health, half malaria infections, tuberculosis death, expanded immunization for about $1 billion, we could save 1 million lives every year. According to Gavi, we estimate that for every dollar spent, you do $60 worth of good. Some of the very, very best things, universal access contraception, would do $120 of good for every dollar spent, and actually free trade, it turned out to be the very best thing, would do almost $2,000 of good. This is just a small sample of it. This is the full list. I'm not expecting you to read this. I brought you a folder so you can, this is our, our one-page summary for the world. There's also a big Cambridge University Press book, so you can come and pick up this, this folder afterwards if you're interested. So it's just the short version of that argument. But in reality, the point here is to recognize that there are lots and lots of things that we can do for the world. Some of them are incredibly good, some of them are not so good. And I want to make sure that we don't just do, for instance, climate change badly and end up wasting trillions of dollars every year when we could have spent that money both fixing climate change much more effectively, but also recognizing climate change is not actually the end of the world that we're being told, it's a problem. And recognizing that there are so many other things both the world asks us to do, but also that we could do that would end up doing much more good. So if we could start that conversation, I would love to have that with you, both here now with the Q&A, and of course also later throughout the week, and hopefully for the rest of the world, so we can actually have this discussion and make sure we make the right decision. So thank you very much, and let me hear your questions.